Oh my God.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to ArtiFact number 32. I am joined by Jessica Schneider and UK painter Ethan Pinch. Jessica actually just completed an article for our website, automachination.com, on James Cameron's The Terminator. And by the time that you're watching this, it's already going to be live on the website. So maybe for context, you could read that. We're going to discuss her article. We're going to discuss both Cameron films, actually. That's Terminator 1 as well as Terminator 2, Judgment Day. We're going to do some comparisons, some contrasts. Both of them, to the extent that they are genre films, right? They are very well executed. They are very well done. I do think Terminator 2 is a little bit better, although there are honestly some parts of Terminator 1 that are interesting in and of themselves, and also, perhaps a little bit better than some of the ways that maybe either thematic content or perhaps some symbolism or maybe even some anti-symbols were handled, right, in Terminator 1 versus 2, right? I do have some preferences there. So just by way of introduction, right? So this to Jessica has always been a kind of formative film for her. In her article, she discusses how, she would be in Blockbuster waiting for, to rent a movie, right? Choosing a movie, right? That's like a common sort of 80s experience, 90s experience. For me, the reason why both of these films were formative, as well as some other Schwarzenegger films like Total Recall. I grew up actually just not speaking English, and I learned a lot of English by watching movies. And I would always watch Schwarzenegger films in the early 90s as I was learning English. And I remember, like, little by little, right? Like, first I would not understand anything that was going on. And then he would and he was perfect for learning English because he would have to sort of forcefully say certain words. And I would say, okay, although it's accented, like I've heard this kind of thing before. And little by little, right, more and more sort of make sense to me. And I think it kind of explains maybe the way that I am now. But anyway, let's just sort of get into it. Do you guys are we in agreement that Terminator 2 is probably the superior film? Maybe we could start with Jessica.
I would say so, because that film definitely hits emotional highs, a depth that the first film doesn't. The first film, I think, is a great, genre film. It's a great action film. I mean, Ethan had written, he thought it was like a good equivalent to a good slasher film. I mean, I definitely think it's witty and clever, and we'll talk more about why. But with Terminator 2, there's a depth of emotion there. I mean, at the end when, the machine has to be lowered into that, the hot fire or whatever that is. And you actually, I cry when I see that. I mean, because you definitely see John is this empathetic, soft-hearted kid, and he loves the machine, but the machine, tells him, I know now why you cry, but it's something I can never do. And they build this relationship over time, and he serves as a father figure. And then this is something I mentioned in my T2 review, which you've not seen, but I'll send it to you for next month, is that, it's almost like they kind of switch, they kind of like, there's moments where John has to sort of father him, like, you just can't go around killing people. Why? You just can't. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't really have a reason other than you can't, because it's wrong,
Yeah.
And, but yes, I would definitely put that one as reaching a depth that the first one doesn't quite have.
What do you think, Ethan?
Well, which is superior?
Yeah,
it's difficult to say. That there's different ways in which one can enter into a film. Both of these films are Hollywood films, basically. I mean, these are both, more so than any film I've ever talked about with you, Alex, or you, Jess, on camera. These are products of, the Los Angeles industrial film complex, and to the point where they've become part of the iconography, if you will, of kind of late 20th century blockbuster kind of popcorn films. You know, you think about Spielberg, you think about, you know, Lucas films, but also James Cameron, you know, and of course he would go on to have even more success later with Avatar and Titanic, it goes without saying. I think it's interesting because even as genre films, and these are, Cameron has a keen awareness of genre. He's a protege of Roger Corman, right? You know, Attack of the Wasp Woman, all this stuff. They are kind of interesting in how they are bringing together different genre forms, genre sensibilities, as it were. Even in the first Terminator film, that's a very American slasher kind of film, right? It's basically Halloween by John Carpenter, but it's also got a very Italian sensibility to it, I think, when I watch it. The atmosphere, the light, the soundtrack, my God. The second film is the stakes are a bit different, because the first film, James Cameron is quite happy to have a hit, but with Terminator 2, he needs he needs a massive hit. He needs a huge success because The Abyss hasn't done so well financially. So he needs to pull out all the stops. No, it didn't really. I mean, a lot of, well, he's a production guy, isn't he? And a lot of money went into the special effects of The Abyss, and I don't think it really recouped its profits the way they wanted to. So with T2, Cameron needed a huge hit. So here, it's much more of a spectacular kind of film. The psychodrama, let's say, of the first film is kind of replaced by more of a heroic bloodshed kind of film. You know, more you know, special effects, more gunplay, dramatic themes of you know, brotherhood, rebellion, etc., etc. And it's a road trip movie. Now, this is the genre. You know, I was saying cross genre. It's a horror, sci-fi, buddy road trip film. You know, and so I think sort of that's it. It's sort of almost bacchanalian, kind of over the topness of the second film is what makes it kind of genius in a way. It's like so hyped up and so amphetamine driven. It's kind of really, it retains a lot of power, even though there are some aspects that have dated poorly, you know, in the interim. Like you could say the Guns N' Roses soundtrack.
You don't like the song? Oh my God! Well, you guys,
I can give or take it, but it's a specific pop culture reference, which dates. I mean, you could say the same thing about like the cars on the road or what have you.
Well, but, you know, the film is actually set in 1995. It's not. It came out in 91, but it's actually set in 95 because John was born in 85 and he's 10. So that is, you know, that's a little trick because it doesn't look like 95. I know these differences because I'm a child in the 90s.
See, that's lost on someone like me who was like, you know, I was born in 95. But just to answer Alex's question, I think there's actually an interesting conversation we can have about kind of which really is the superior. But personally, the impression of the second film on me was very strong. And, you know, I wasn't born when it came out, but it was being re-released, kind of shown on TV when Terminator Salvation, during the time of the Beijing Olympics, was being brought out. And I saw that at roughly 11, 12 years old on television. And it was like a watershed moment for me too. It was like, wow, this is a really grown up film. So like, well, you know, at the same time, I'd seen RoboCop as well. I'd never seen such explosive violence and people saying fuck and asshole every other sentence. You know, it was just really
you made a good point. There's definitely a lot more cursing in the second one.
It's much more kind of like there's a cruel streak to it as well. Like you know, like even the scene where, you know, the comedy moments where Terminator kneecaps that alarm agent with his gun and says he'll live. You know, that's quite dark. You know, even for a light moment.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I wanted to ask, which is better, well, first of all, like that's just kind of like where my mind goes anyway, right? Regardless if you give me two artistic objects. But when I was just rewatching these films in preparation for the show, I guess I had forgotten how well crafted even, you know, a sort of like mostly genre film like Terminator was. And also just kind of like beyond the fact that it's well crafted. I mean, there's a lot potentially going on beneath the surface, right? So like, for example, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was first looking at, or rather like while he was filming without seeing the actual edits, I guess in the first few days or few weeks, whatever it was, he was like, I'm just doing this kind of like shitty film. It seems like a dumb movie. But then when he saw like the first like 15 or 20 minutes, he was like, wow, there's actually something really interesting going on here, which I can sort of imagine. I mean,
you can't really blame him for that either, considering.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if most of the time, if you were to shoot a movie like this, you would act in it, you would think like, this probably isn't really going anywhere, right?
After Conan the Barbarian, Conan the Barbarian was before this, wasn't it?
Yes,
I think it was. I think it was maybe during the same time, because he was like filming. He was filming something, and he was like constantly tired.
I think Conan was like 83, but again, I'm not an expert on that. Conan,
I think some of the filming was around the same time, actually, as maybe he was working both films at the same time. But anyway, so when I came back to rewatch the film, I was like, all right, so I know what happens here. Let me just try to imagine like seeing it for the first time, right? Imagine if you've never seen a trailer, or never read any kind of synopses or whatever. What would you think is going on here, just without any kind of prior information? And I mean, so like the Terminator 1 opens up with this kind of like ball of electricity, right? It's surprisingly so much of that, so many of the special effects here just aren't really dated, because they actually don't go too far, like they don't push the envelope too much. Whereas I think in Terminator 2, some of the special effects, even though you could tell they're more advanced, they're still very dated by modern standards, simply by virtue of trying to do more, whereas Terminator 1 doesn't really have that problem. So anyway, we have this like ball of energy, and suddenly we have this like man that appears, and he's naked. We have no idea what this is about, what he's going to do. Why does he appear here? And why is he sort of naked, standing out there, looking over the city, like as if he's assessing something, right? Maybe he has some kind of mission or whatever's going on, right? And that gives it a kind of like odd, almost like biblical quality, right? This kind of naked man that is in many ways just kind of like maybe it's a bit much to say he's kind of like an idealized physical figure. I mean, if you look at whatever's considered classical Greek or Roman, people don't tend to look at that, because
he was Mr. Universe, wasn't he?
But what I'm saying is like by ancient standards, you normally would not ever have people that would look like that, because there weren't actual bodybuilders in the modern sense, right? So he's a much more kind of like modern ideal man, right? The kind of proportions that are possible between everything from like modern sort of fitness techniques, as well as steroids and other stuff like that, right? But
he's like the golem. Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's basically what he is,
Yeah. And it works to his advantage, right? Because if you think about this kind of a thing, right, that's supposed to be foreign, right? As a robot, supposed to be foreign, as a, someone that seems like is not a native English speaker to those around him, right? There's a kind of foreign quality. And the fact, just like physically, right, he's so imposing, right? That gives him this kind of like otherworldly quality that you don't necessarily get, like when you have I forget what is the name of the father, Kyle
Reese, I believe.
Kyle Reese.
Yeah, Kyle Reese. Like when you see Kyle appear, also from this ball of energy, I don't think maybe he is also totally naked, but his proportions are much more kind of like closer to more kind of like Greek Roman, classical.
The whole body build, it's already a kind of uncanny thing, that kind of sculpted form. But I totally agree with what you're saying about Arnold being a foreigner. I mean, the Terminator, this what one can't ignore, the timely Cold War themes, right? I mean, basically, he's a Manchurian candidate. He's kind of the ultimate communist in a way. Well, that it's totally open to that reading. Perhaps that reading becomes threatened, troubled in the second film. But at this point, like that whole threat of nuclear Armageddon is totally a staple of like that Cold War paranoia.
Yeah. And I want to actually touch on all of that when we get more into the second film. But so anyway, like this is kind of like how it looks like, right? We have this
You notice though, Kyle comes in and he's not as calm. Like Arnold looks like he's almost like a fetus, and he kind of like falls. It's like more painful. Like they're like, "Get out of here!"
And he obviously has, actual sort of responses. He seems to be in physical pain. He seems to be unsure in a way that, the Terminator is not. And you sort of, you kind of put together fairly quickly that one of these is, at the very least, one of them is human, if not both of them. At the very least, Kyle is human. He has those qualities. I think it was a very good choice to, make him lean, make him kind of like, muscular and athletic in that way, but still not the kind of proportions that Schwarzenegger has, which gives him this kind of quality this is what a human being looks like.
We know all about the sort of story with the casting, right? Reese and Schwarzenegger originally having one another's roles. That Reese was going to play the Terminator, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was going to be the hero. This makes me think that perhaps the sleek Terminator of the second film was sort of going to be the Terminator we were going to get in the original installment.
Yeah, it was supposed to be. Yeah,
a kind of sort of ninja-like Terminator. Instead, we go for the golem imposing sort of gigantic killer, which puts him again, I think, closer to Mike Myers, to kind of the sort of the hulking, unstoppable killer of John Carpenter's Halloween. But yeah, it is funny to think that originally the intention was to have Arnie be the love interest / hero rather than the villain.
Yeah,
and I think though you got to have the underdog be a little quote unquote weaker. So that's why in the second film you have Robert Patrick, who's great cast. Like he's like, I say in my review, he's like a snake. He's just like this very thin, and he gives this menacing look on his face, no emotion. It's like a flat affect. And then Arnold being big, but he's a lower model, and he's not a T1000, he's a T800. So I do point out though in the review, if Arnold Terminator can do any voice, and yet why does he do this Austrian accent? It's just kind of funny, because it's like, if he can do any voice, wouldn't he just want to sound like some native Los Angeles person and blend in? But again, those are kind of the suspension of disbelief. You just have to accept it.
And for what it's worth, it does work to make him other, to make him strange. And at his best in that film, Arnie does sort of totally personify that kind of golem-like sort of implacability. Other times I feel like it's more him just being challenged by his acting abilities sometimes.
True, but it works. It really does work to his advantage.
I don't think it disrupts the film. Whereas, like, if you imagine Schwarzenegger in like a straight drama, right, it just wouldn't work, right? So I'm glad that
acting does markedly improve, or is captured in a better context by the second film, where I mean, he definitely has to do more in that regard. But to get back, if one just compares though of Schwarzenegger's performance in this first film to the performance of what was his name again, the Patrick fellow who does the second Terminator, in the second,
Robert
Patrick, like that is just such a focused, laser-like performance, really menacing. Really, that's really a world away from the kind of eyes like piss holes in the snow performance we get from Arnie in the first film.
And also the second Terminator, right? The T1000. I thought it was a great idea that, well, first of all, it was good that Cameron sort of didn't listen to his instincts about like, hey, let's have these, let's have Arnold as the hero, right? This kind of otherness really works for Terminator 1. But also you definitely have a kind of a otherness in a more kind of, there's a more kind of like unconventional, there's like, maybe conventional nightmares and unconventional nightmares, right? Maybe a conventional nightmare might be if you're getting chased by somebody or whatever, right? Clearly kind of like, human or whatever. But there's like unconventional nightmares that would look maybe like the sort of murder scenes that you have in with the T1000, right? For example, the knife hand that kills the stepfather, that kind of thing. The fact that you don't even see the death of the stepmother, right? It's just kind of like assumed, and it has this kind of like nightmarish, disturbing quality. The fact that he's leaning
I would
that.
say in the first film, there is much more of this implication. So all that Hitchcockian implication of horror. Whereas in the second film, we kind of do get to see much more graphically the blades going into people getting killed, there's much less of that euphemistic metaphorical thing going on in the second film.
Yeah, although even in that case, right, you have so like in the first film, right, from the very beginning, although you're sort of given a little bit of maybe to like empathize a little bit with the Terminator character in the first few seconds, like when the punks accost him or whatever, and he hasn't done anything yet, right, to sort of get any sort of disrespect or any kind of threats to his life. But very quickly, right, when he just outright murders one of them by, I'm not sure if he actually pulls out a heart or if
I think he does,
or if he just, sort of punches through and, kills them in that way. But immediately, right, that kind of scene turns you just like emotionally against the Terminator, right? You think like, oh, so this is supposed to be some kind of villain, right? Because a non-villainous person, even if, he's trying to protect himself, wouldn't respond in this way. In the second film, like stuff is said, he says stuff like, well, why am I not supposed to kill, right? And although he says that, immediately in the second film, he behaves very differently, right? He does not kill in a wanton fashion, right? The beginning biker scene, he beats them up maybe or whatever, and he takes her clothes, takes her money, takes the bike, but he doesn't murder anyone, right? And he tries to avoid that for much of the film, even before he's commanded, right, against murder by John Connor. So anyway, to get back to this original idea of like, imagine watching Terminator from like before even like having any information about it. So ball of energy, the Terminator sort of standing there. He's like he's watching the city. You don't know where this is going, right? But it seems symbolic. There seems to be some kind of metaphorical quality. You get the scene with the punks where it's made to sort of completely turn you against the Terminator. And then, we have Kyle, right? What is this about? Second time that this happens. That they're going to meet in some way, but you don't know exactly for what purpose. So just purely, if you just want to view it as a kind of like, plot machinations, they're very well done, right? Like there's like so much suspense. There's just enough information, right, to keep you not, totally confused, but little by little things get unfolded. And before we start recording, we Ethan and I both independently actually mentioned that this is a very similar to what happens in terms of like world building in Chris Marker's, the English translation is The Jetee, right? We actually reviewed this film in this channel, right, some months ago, where it gives you just enough information about like what's going on so that you have like the basic plot behind you, but quickly, like we move on to other territory, right? We don't dwell necessarily in those worlds. We dwell in the present day, what all this means in the present day, right? Here we have this time warp, we have other things going on, right? And I think that's very good, right? It's one thing that is kind of a little bit cringeworthy is when the opposite happens, right? This is much more kind of indicative of like maybe like video games in the modern day where you have tons and tons of writing and overwriting, all this description of like what's going on in the background, which honestly, it's not that relevant if you could just get it out of the way in a paragraph or so, Yeah. So.
Which is, I think, what puts this in the realm of like a traditional kind of Hitchcockian psycho thriller. I mean, the similarities to La Jetée are intriguing and sort of endlessly fascinating, but they're kind of superficial, more or less, because it's time travel, right? I think, when I think of this film, I think this is like basically the story of an assassin chasing a victim, and so there's an assassin, a victim, and the bodyguard, and that's like, this is the classic thriller story, but it has these embellishments of sort of Philip K. Dick, Harlan Ellison, speculative fiction on the end, which sort of get you hooked. But in that sense, it's a really well-oiled mechanism. This is a Swiss engineering sort of storytelling. Everything, there's no, like you're saying, there's no desultory kind of like, although there are points in the first film where there is a bit of a lag I think about more than halfway into the film, there's a bit of a lag. It keeps up its momentum and it kind of does its job. And even more so in the second film, there is this thrust, this locomotion where everything just leads on very quickly and very efficiently. Cameron is a very pragmatic guy in terms of his working relations with people, his ideas, the way he does special effects. He's very in that way he's the master, one of the last in Hollywood today.
Well, one of the things about the first film that really make it resonate is the little characters, the little scenes that normally wouldn't be as memorable, like you have where Sarah's going into her shift and she's a bad waitress and she lacks confidence, and she interactions with her coworkers, and then you have her roommate, all those little scenes, and even the little scene with like the boyfriend, the roommate's boyfriend, who's like doing a pervy phone call, and
that scene's also great. Brilliant, and sort of again typical sort of slasher film moment. That
Yep. And then also too the cops, the two cops, and how they kind of go have a back and forth, and how do I look? Like shit, your mama. Like just little things like that in a B movie or something, you don't really get those little layers. And so I remember, when I saw this, and it's also time travel back into the 80s, reminds me of my youth. And I remember when I saw this, it was sort of like, somebody had once, I knew years ago, again, had very basic taste in filmmaking, or films rather. And, this is before I even got into, the films I watch now. And he just had this idea that I only like these strange, odd films. Where would you get that idea? Anyway. And then I said, well, I watched the Terminator, and he was like shocked that I would think that was good. And I was like, why would you say that? I'm like, obviously it's like not understanding. It's like, if you can write it well and craft good characters and you have a good story, it can work. You think of watching a lot of the like Hollywood blockbusters, and it's all just, brain dead kind of action, and kind of lose me in that. I'm not, but this one, when you care about the characters, you already a good story, good setup. Also the evolution of Sarah's character, going from timid in the beginning, but you see elements of her warrior quality coming out. Even in the first film, she has moments of that. And then she evolves into being much more tough in the second one. But she's underneath that. She's really she is, she's emotionally reactive. She's emotionally volatile, as we see.
I think there's always a strong element of melodrama in James Cameron's film. I mean, it's more obvious in saying like Avatar or, my God, Titanic. But, the melodrama is definitely there in Terminator, and becomes more pronounced in the second film. Like in fact becomes almost shrill, kind of like in terms of like the emotions going on. But this is there's a psychodrama element too, like that I've mentioned, and but it's, you could say there's like a very strong psychosexual element to the film, in terms of, Sarah's a young woman, and these sort of Freudian elements in here, because essentially the Terminator is coming to kill her because she's going to have sex and give birth. I mean, there's a kind of a reproductive theme going on. Like, maybe I'm not qualified to really talk about what that is or what that means, but it's still relevant now. I mean, God, like our current
right.
This whole theme of sort of reproductive rights and sort of people's autonomy and what have you. I mean, and sex is in the background of Terminator 1 quite strongly, even with, from the pervy phone call to like Sarah being a kind of like a virginal ingenue, almost like a Virgin Mary kind of figure, right? She's going to give birth to the Messiah,
Yeah.
There's all kinds of
well, do you know one little subtlety I caught? Do you remember when she's getting the pervy phone call? She's wearing a large white t-shirt and it has a picture of the Jetsons on it. The futuristic family, the Jetsons. And I go, oh, isn't that
the space age nuclear family?
Yep.
Yeah.
And no, it's just little things like that. I caught that rewatching it. I go, oh, I didn't, I was like, oh, I see where that comes in.
You talk about the characters, like by the end of the film, like Sarah's a single mother, caught in this kind of quite operatic narrative of robots from the future. That's quite an interesting character, right? By the second film, Sarah Connor becomes the sort of most interesting character. She becomes the kind of like main character for me. Particular Terminator.
One thing that I found interesting that Jessica said. So like, yeah, like you knew this person who couldn't believe that you would be interested in Terminator if you were interested in weird films by Bergman and so on. And I think that way, like a film like Terminator is a really good barometer for just gauging someone's, detached internal consistency, right? Because I can imagine, tons of people that indiscriminately love, like genre films, cult films. I mean, there's whole YouTube channels dedicated to this, websites dedicated to we only watch horror, right? This is all that we're into. We horror, right? Other people are just sci-fi, and to them, right, they would probably consider both Terminator 1 and 2 to be classics. But they might not necessarily have a positive response to a Bergman film, right? Or some other kind of straight drama, and vice versa, right? There are plenty of people that might find themselves or think of themselves as too serious for Terminator, right? And that means that they're closing themselves off to, just some of the interesting objective things that are happening on screen, irrespective of whether or not it fits their personal aesthetic, whether or not it fits, some, outside stuff they might be interested in. So, in that way, it's interesting. And so Ethan mentions a couple of times now this idea of this kind of like Freudian dynamic, and I'll grant I think this is partly, you could say this is what's going on, but it's a kind of Freudianism that is happening under the auspices of maybe what Ethan had alluded to earlier, this kind of, like capitalism versus communism dynamic, right? Is this,
that Freudianism and that capitalist critique can happen absolutely hand in hand,
exactly.
Nuclear family. And what is that if not kind of a perfect kind of Freudian capitalist form,
Well, going back on what you were saying, I think there's this sort of idea that people will assume, or like, again, that let's say someone like this individual I knew years ago who thought I had, this person has basic taste. They have this assumption that I would not look to something as good if it's commercial. Like the two are, if it's commercial, it sucks. And generally it can be true a lot, but sometimes not the case. Now I'll give another example. Was many years ago, I remember, again, being around people, very basic film tastes, bringing up Planet of the Apes when the second Planet of the Apes came out, or the Burton film, which, the first one's obviously better. And I had mentioned that, it lacked the depth of the first one or something. And then this girl just like I worked with, she looks at me, she goes, it's about monkeys. And I was like, no, it has like political undertones. I'm like, duh, social, like, I was like, it's very obvious. And she just gave me this look like I'm a snob or like
Animal Farm, that's just a book about pigs.
And I'm like, how can you? I mean, granted, this girl read like Oprah books, but I'm like, how can you not even consider this? And so it's like when there's a layer and there's depth. I mean, I don't know. So I think
I love how scandalized Jess gets when people don't understand her taste.
I don't like when people try to
it's
box
not just
in
taste.
I don't like when people box in what. And again, it depends on where it's coming from.
Has to do, though. But it has to do surely with the historical sort of the different ways that people view films. Like we were just mentioning B movies. People watch B movies very differently than we watch our movies now. Back in the old days of the Nickelodeon, where you could go out with a bunch of friends in the night, and you could watch 5, 6 movies back to back, and they'd all be kind of shit, but usually there'd be something, there'd be a B movie usually has 1 or 2 really good things. Everything else, like, that's how people would remember films, and that's how people would go home and they would talk about them. I just saw this film, and it was like, and so like films would have to distribute. They would, word of mouth played a big role, and so there was a lot of a lot of cutting corners and a lot of rough edges. But I mean, be someone like Cameron is like trying to do everything. He's trying to give you this good special effects, the good story. He's making a B movie, but he's giving it real integrity, because he wants it to distribute. He wants it to like, he wants to have like a good, he's not going to do like 100 films like Roger Corman, and maybe 5 of them are actually pretty good films. He's going to do that one really good film that's going to totally, go out into pop. And the influence of Terminator, like we were saying, people might not think this is a very highbrow film, and it's not, but the influence of Terminator in the art world, as well as other technical categories, technical mediums, like comic books, like video games, like music, the music industry, and not just rock music, but I've seen experimental musicians who are like Terminator and make reference to it. It's gone out, and it's kind of like we're saying, it's become like an iconic thing. It's just an iconic film, but it's made its sort of mark in all these different sort of ways. Its aesthetic, its sort of its scale perhaps has made a real sort of difference that has crossed over a lot of different barriers of taste and discernment of what makes a quote unquote good film.
Yeah.
Well, and like I said, I don't like when people, it depends on where it's coming from, and they're trying to box in, and they seem to think that they know what my taste or how I judge my standards. Because I'm sure there are people I know who think, oh, well, she thinks any recent film or whatever, well, they wouldn't say film, they'd say movie, is crap anyway. And I mean, it's like, well, not necessarily true.
To make a really good film that people, because how many people will have watched these films? Who's going to go back and watch the first Terminator film at this point? You know what I mean? As good as that film is, a lot of people haven't seen Terminator 1 now. They usually start.
Well, and I think
I started with 2 actually. I remember like it was a while before I went back and saw 1. So
well,
I
think there's this thing too, and again, it depends on who your audience is and who we're talking to. No one who's listening to this channel has this issue, but people who I've known people who get to a point where they're like, they don't watch older films. They just have no interest. And especially, oh my God, it's black and white. Oh my God. And it's like, there are people like this out there. And I'm like, you are totally closing yourself off. You are totally like limiting yourself. And I remember thinking, okay, so how old does a film need to be before you render it meaningless and worthless? It's like, that this doesn't make any sense. But
you'll drive yourself crazy. Like I can totally sympathize. My opinion is that filmmaking went downhill when pictures started talking. But so let's pay no mind to like the Philistines.
I know. But this is a film that you could also have some cinema people going, they're looking at Terminator. And again, you could thumb your nose at that.
Alex was talking about the psychology of the Terminator thing, and it's like, and I find in your reviews, Jess, that like you have a really keen sense for like the psychology, the inner worlds of the characters, and sort of the way that filmmakers are able to explore that. Don't you feel that there's a kind of not wanting to oversell it here, but there is a sort of richness of psychology, maybe at least symbolically, in the first film, in terms of the motherhood thing, the sort of the war of the sexes, maybe capitalism, communism, sort of lurking in the background. Isn't that there? Don't you agree?
Well, and it's interesting because it's sort of like I've always questioned. Kyle comes back in time. Oh, one of the things I did notice. Here now I'm remembering what I said. Why she is so drawn to him, obviously, other than being hot, but the fact that he views her differently than everyone else does. He looks at her. It was a chance to meet the legend. You know, you're a warrior. He almost has her on a pedestal, and she probably likes it. You know, I mean, who wouldn't? And it's like me, the clumsy waitress. You know, she doesn't even have the little kid. Doesn't respect her. Puts the ice cream in her pocket, and then you have this guy who like calls her a legend, and she's like, "What are you talking about?" But it's just, then I think that boosts her confidence. That's where you start seeing some of it come out.
James Cameron falls in love with Linda Hamilton. You know, I think like that's all, like he's really is like trying to make you kind of fall in love with her, like if not through Kyle Reese, like, you know, the whole the way the camera looks at her, you know, she's elevated.
In terms
she's not
of
just the final girl, you know.
In terms of the psychology, one thing that I found useful is to kind of like view the psychology in a kind of, you know, robotic, I guess, mechanistic way. I think it captures the logic of like AI and computer programming very well across both films, right? In the second film, like you see more examples of the fact that, you know, there's a big difference, right, between the way that a human being might behave versus a machine, despite the fact that in both cases, right, a human being is, you know, little more than, you know, some sort of object-oriented organism. It's just that our objects, like by virtue of being, you know, complex human beings, our objects can be sublimated any number of different directions. Like if you want to, you know, start with a kind of, you know, evolutionary standpoint of human beings are merely vehicles for their genetic material, and the number one goal is, you know, even at risk to yourself, you have to somehow pass this genetic material on, right? That is a kind of object-oriented behavior. But the difference is with the machines, right? They have the same objects, but they're far more limited, they're far more specific, and they don't necessarily have a way of discriminating between the right end, rather the correct means versus the wrong means of achieving these objects. And you see this and you see little by little how some of these characters that either believe in this coming, you know, Armageddon in the future, or have already been part of it, they start behaving much more like machines. Like if you see Sarah Connor in the second film, she's in some ways a completely different actress, right? In many respects in the second film. And you see her doing things that are like you could easily miss, like when she gets mad at her son, right, for breaking into the hospital and trying to free her. It's because she has this idea in her head, like, you know, my object now, right? It's not to merely, you know, pass on my genetics. That's already done, right? I have my son, right? He's already out there. I have to now make sure that he's protected. And my object now is to make sure that this future either doesn't come to pass, or maybe we could reduce it somewhat. So she's perfectly willing to like literally die and never see her son again, never have any kind of emotional connection, right? So she's sort of given up that aspect of her humanity. She doesn't totally understand when he starts complaining. It's like, but I wanted to see you, right? I wanted to, you know, have, you know, something more to do with you other than you being my crazy mother that I never see again, right? And later on, when she breaks into the scientist's house, what is his name? Dyson?
Miles Dyson.
So when she breaks into Dyson's house, it's very much like a scene that could be from Terminator 1, right? With this kind of totally, you know, object-oriented, goal-oriented being, right? That is there to do only one thing, just be an assassin. Whatever the externalities are, doesn't matter, right? You have one goal only. You either hit upon it or you don't, right? She becomes much more machine-like, and little by little, right, there has to be this kind of negotiation between the two.
But it stops when you have the little boy getting on, don't kill my daddy. She has empathy. She can't do it. It makes her cry, you know, and that's obviously something with the machine. But one of the things, speaking of psychology, I used to always think when Kyle told Sarah in the first film about, you know, you've been targeted for termination, I always compared the Terminator to sort of like the way you would think maybe a narcissist or a psychopath or somebody with antisocial personality disorder, in the sense that he doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and he absolutely will not stop ever, you know. And it's like kind of like that's how people like that operate. They don't feel remorse. I mean, you know, they just don't have the conscience. Terminator doesn't. But then you also look at it and you say, well, the Terminator of himself, Terminator, there's no good or bad Terminator. It's just a matter of perspective. It's just how he's programmed. Even if he's programmed to kill, the second one, according to that, he thinks he's doing the right thing. This is from his perspective.
Yeah,
So
putting a human skin on him, right? Giving him something that is like human-like. That's why it sort of magnifies what we would, you know, or rather anthropomorphizes what we would say is, you know, this is sociopathic behavior, right? But in that context, it's not. It's merely, you know, an object-oriented, you know, set of procedures, set of actions, right? And that also brings me to going back to Ethan's comments on like, so is Skynet something that could be viewed as you know, as a metaphor for communism or capitalism? Because again, we have 1984, right, is when Terminator 1 came out. We still have the Cold War going on. The USSR is still around. By 1991, I'm not sure if it, you know, came out like after or before the collapse or whatever. But the point is, you could sort of say it could be one or the other. But the way that I would view it is capitalism and communism, specifically in terms of, you know, two cartels, right? You don't even have to take a position on whether or not you like capitalism or communism. You could just view them as two, let's call them sociopathic cartels. Sociopathic in the Terminator sense of there's an object, right? You are object oriented. You have to hit upon this object. In both cases, geopolitically, capitalism has to force itself and spread, right? Oftentimes totally by force, because not everyone is so, you know, enamored with this idea of like Western style liberalism. And communism the same way, right? It has to spread itself by force, largely because not everyone is enamored by this idea or by this, you know, set of promises that if you come, you know, under the auspices of communism, you will get X, Y, and Z, right? Not everybody necessarily believes this. So I think to go back also to this idea of Freudianism, it's also like I would view it under that rubric, right? This idea that yes, this is a Terminator sent back to prevent this woman from becoming pregnant and giving birth to the son, but not because of any sort of like inward jealousy, but because there was something that was created that just needs to spread by any means possible, right? So, you know, I and geopolitically, I would view like, again, whatever cartel happens to be in charge of the world, right? It's always like in that sort of aspect of just this need to spread, even if there's tons and tons of costs along the way, even if the end goal isn't even all that good, right? I think the point is to focus on what are these, you know, costs along the way, right? Which is why it starts to see so similar to, you know, like why the Terminator seems so similar to a sociopath.
Kind of apocalyptic eschatology, isn't it? It's like it's the threat of nuclear Armageddon. I mean, that's there in T1 and T2, especially in very graphic imagery in the second film. But it's that kind of, I don't know what it felt like to grow up in sort of the Cold War and sort of like have that kind of that thing looming over me. I mean, I've talked to people who have, and it's there in so much of it. The meaning, I mean, it's just so recognizable at this point. I mean, that's why I think it's important to make a distinction between the first and the second film when it comes to these topics, because slight but significant differences happen. I think in that first film, it is very much, like we were saying, like a psycho thriller. There's this unstoppable killer who's pursuing his victim. In the second film, it's a bit different, and the whole time travel logic is a bit different too. Because in the first film, and I mentioned this in my notes to you guys, in the first film, it's kind of a bit like a la Jetee, closed loop, circular time travel story, you know? Skynet travels back into the past to kill Sarah Connor. But in traveling back into the past, Skynet brings about John Connor's birth, you know, because if Skynet didn't try and kill Sarah Connor, Kyle Reese would never have gone back and gotten her knocked up. So it becomes like a little closed loop, right?
I always, in that scene, I go, now they have to make John.
Yeah. Baby time. Well, by the second film, the time travel stuff is a bit different, because the implication now is that Skynet is somehow in this constant war in our present, quote unquote, present, to write itself into the future. So the normal cause and effect of time travel has been glitched. I was saying this is almost epitomized by the second Terminator. You know, the normal rules of inertia don't work on him. Break him apart into pieces.
Yep. Which, oh, by the way,
together.
I'm going to tell you. So I haven't sent you my review yet, Alex, which I will. I told you, but I want
the second one. You mean Terminator 2? Okay.
It's already written. Yes, I'm going to be sending it to you, but it's for next month, obviously. But one, I want listeners to know that there is a scene in there that always reminded me of two Sylvia Plath poems. And I note it in the review. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And you're like, oh my God, it's always been there. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting.
Okay.
I would say the kind of the threat is different in both films. The kind of and it's like the stakes are different in a way. It's almost like a different Skynet, as it were. But again, that's almost
Skynet becomes self-aware. That's the whole thing on that. Once they become self-aware, it's
like this fear though of something. It's this fear of it. Whereas I feel like in the first film there is this kind of Hitchcockian metaphorical fear. Kind of in the second film, it's much more literal and superficial. It's like this fear of the future, like a haunted future, rather than in a horror film where there's like a haunted past that's threatening to erupt into the present. You know, a ghost, a haunting. It's the future that's haunted, coming back into the present. You know what I mean? And it's like, no matter what you do to kill it, it'll keep finding a way to. So it's almost this now cosmic horror instead of just this quite European, almost Kafkaesque sort of a story of like people in the trying to fight their way out of a loop story. It becomes something else, becomes something more spectacular and weird. The weirdness.
Well, those are some good observations, because remember, we started talking about this, Alex, when we did the Before trilogy. And I remember I said, when's the present? When's the past? Because those films all bleed together. And the same thing is with the Terminator. And that's how it was two things. It's kind of the time thing reminded me of the films, but also the evolution, like you see evolution of Celine in those films and the evolution of Sarah. Yeah, in the Terminators, you're like, what is the present? We don't know. Is 84 the past, but then it's the present then? And it just
I agree, but I would also not wanting to forget the comments about Sarah Connor and her becoming a Terminator, basically. I mean, you see all kinds of these strange role reversions in the second film, and I suppose we're onto talking about the second film now. But you know, Sarah Connor becomes a Terminator. The Terminator becomes a surrogate father, you know. Jess mentioned that at some point even John assumes the kind of father role, which I always assumed was sort of like the child teaching the father to be cool. You know, this kind of awkward generational gap metaphor. But I kind of agree with what Jess says, that sometimes it's almost like the Terminator is they almost exchange roles of who is the child and who is the parental thing. I think I wouldn't say that kind of, although I think it's very much the case, and it's almost thematically reinforced that Sarah is sort of losing her humanity, as it were, that she snarls, and we literally find her in Bedlam. That's the hysterical tone of the second film. We're in a madhouse for much of the first half. You know, it was all a dream, Sarah. The first film that's great, classic sort of genre film kind of. You see that influence in all sorts of things. I was just reading a comic book the other day, where sort of a superheroine was sort of being told, no, these are all toys, and this is a franchise, you dreamed all of it, and you know, it's like that's from the Terminator. But you know, she is this kind of mad woman, this sort of almost
no one believes her. She's frustrated. I always felt myself identifying with her. I'm like, what's it like to know you're right and no one fucking believes you?
I say she still is the kind of the protective mother figure. I mean, like this sort of she goes to these extremes because of her almost superhuman love for John, and you could almost say it is a kind of I mean, one could argue that maybe she's just thinking about the future and she's just trying to preserve the quote unquote Messiah. But, I think, maybe just because I read so much existentialist philosophy, existentialists, Kierkegaard even was saying like motherhood is one of the few places in this sort of cruel and caring universe where like, an animal will place its life like on the line for like someone else's life, where like, you'll see acts of like incredible bravery and courage where people put their own lives in danger. But we do see her like come up to a line that she's unwilling to cross, when she is confronted with Dyson's children, and she realizes, it's that horror of the death of children and the murder of children that and we see when she has the vision of the apocalypse of Judgment Day. It's outside of a playground, where she's playing with children. That's the real horror. So while I agree that she becomes a terminatrix, as it were, she still is very much that kind of Freudian hysterical mother, almost like a Terminator with penis envy.
And how convenient is it that Linda Hamilton has an identical twin sister who can be in those scenes? In
that scene, yes.
In that scene, and then she's also in the scene with when she's approached, he hurts her arm after that. And so I presume because her sister wouldn't have been as buff. So, but then you don't even need to use the special effects.
Not the only scene in Terminator 2 to make use of twins. What if you recall the scene with the bodyguard who gets attacked by the T-1000? And
the cop, you mean? I think you said that it was the cop.
The security guard.
Okay.
The mental hospital. He's going to get himself a coffee, and he turns around, and the T-1000 shapeshifts into mirror image. That's the actor being quite pragmatic, and why do a special effect when we can just hire his brother?
Yeah.
To comment a couple things that were said. So like in terms of like the more abstract fears going on in Terminator 2, I mean, even the T-1000, right? He's very reminiscent, and some of these abstractions in general are very reminiscent of maybe like that white ball that you get in The Prisoner, right? As a kind of like, it's a sum of, it's a sum of like human fears. It's sort of like, not fully formed, right? There's a kind of like fledgling quality to it, even to the point where like, when, like when you get sort of caught and return to the island, it's always, the protagonist's face is kind of like almost like there's some kind of birthing thing going on, right? It almost looks like that. So there's this idea of like these like incipient sort of fears, right? The nightmarish qualities, and just comparing.
Non-anthropomorphic is a term you use, which I feel again like it heightens the otherness, the weirdness, the strangeness. Whereas the first Terminator is literally this skeleton figure of such a literally the mold of a human. The second Terminator is anything but.
Although it still forces, right, every single time with both films, they're still forced upon you, the anthropomorphic qualities simply by looking like a human being, talking like one, having that voice.
That ties into kind of the Thing by Carpenter. This sort of weird shape-shifting mercurial creature, or the alien, as it were, that has to take hosts. This thing which hides like a replicant in the skin of a human, but that is the creepiness, as it were.
Yeah.
The surface, the superficial look of a human, but behind it, anything but. I mean, what is that? Us, like blah blah blah, etc. etc.
I think also watching both films and going back to the first and vice versa, the two definitely work pretty well together. So like on the one hand, so like in the first film, the ending isn't very good, or I mean sort of like ends on literal cliches with the storm is coming, and you sort of use that Mexican kid who looks a little bit like like a Mexican like pre-colonial native or whatever, right? Kind of like the magical sort of token kid who's able to understand what's going on in the background, blah blah blah. At the same time, like just kind of barring that specific part of the ending, it would otherwise be a good ending simply for the fact that the Terminator, has been destroyed, and yet there's still this idea that there's a future that's coming and we're not going to have a movie about it, right? We know that John Connor has to save the world. We know that Sarah Connor will be part of this as well. We know there might be some sort of Armageddon event that might not be averted very soon. At the same time, we're not actually going to tell you what happens. That's also kind of subversion. But in terms of like interlinking the two films, like I remember just being surprised at how well some of the individual scenes were shot, like in T1. So like after Kyle and Sarah are sort of on the run, they go to sleep. I think it's like under some bridge or like something, right? That's kind of like, you know, it's like somewhere in nature, right? And I remember when they wake up, there's definitely this like sense of like, well, this is what, you know, post-apocalyptic world might look like, because you have some of the greenery, but it's kind of like in these like, you know, maybe random patches. You have all this mist that, you know, who knows where it's coming from.
It kind of reminded me of a little bit like Stalker, you know, how the greenery in Stalker.
Yeah, and so, yeah, exactly. And some of the like the infrastructure, right? It looks like, you know, the paint is peeling, that kind of thing. So there's definitely, even in Terminator 1, a post-apocalyptic feel, like in bits and pieces and hints, right? Scenes that presage some of the more kind of in-your-face things that would be explored and would be in fact happening in Terminator 2, right? And you get a lot more of that if you actually go back to the first film after watching both of them. So there's a nice kind of interplay going on like this, and like, yeah, I mean, even like the psychology, again, going back to the Dyson scene, there's this idea overhanging that scene and others where you start to wonder, so, okay, so human beings would behave more and more like machines in order to, in this very narrow way, like remain competitive. I mean, like, what does that even mean, right? Like, are human beings superior to machines by virtue of the fact that, like with Dyson, like we introduce, like willingly, voluntarily, all these constraints into our behavior? Like we know there's certain things that we can and cannot do that a machine would have no scruples about. Does that make us, you know, weaker? Does that make us less competitive in some way in the long run? Or is that in fact something that goads human beings into being even more competitive down the road, right? By having emotions, by having these sort of things that we respond to in ways that are less predictable than a machine would respond in such ways. I do think there's also an interesting argument about this is actually imperative for human competition, right? If you could maximize empathy in such a way, for instance, where you have, let's just use one example, no poverty. I mean, that is going to maximize human, you know, utility. That's going to maximize flourishing. That's going to maximize, you know, all the positive goods. Like, I mean, I think of people like Dan Schneider, right? How many people are there that, you know, maybe like Dan had these sort of like inklings of something greater than, something more, but instead we're swallowed up by their gangs, we're swallowed up by their circumstances, right? So that's kind of like an interesting dynamic to think about, just like when you see these divergent paths of evolutions that machines and human beings have to take, you know, just by virtue of just having, you know, just responding differently to various stimuli. But anyway,
I think though that the overall tone of the first and the second film, though, both of them, is kind of one of sort of cynical, almost like apocalypticism. I think there is this sort of there's hope at the end of the first Terminator film, right? You know, like this, I mean, almost bordering on sentimentality, but like ultimately, like there's this real kind of pessimism I feel about society and about people going on in those films. Even more heightened in the second film. Like, yeah, we see like street punks, like, and unfriendly people in the first film, what have you. In the second film, I mean, like, we start that film and we're seeing like a mental institution where guards are beating people. You know, we're seeing like figures of power or whatever, like abusing it. And we're seeing like, and you know, all these scenes set in the mall, and like the fights at bars. I mean, it's like, and then as if to really hammer the point home, that scene where the little kids in the trailer park, I believe, are playing with the toy guns, and the Terminator gives this sort of like, it's in your nature to destroy yourselves. You know, like there's this sort of very bleak commentary about, I suppose, like, you know, society, tail end of the Cold War, American society, perhaps. I mean, you could say that, in the first film, there's something very un-American about the Terminator, the very, not just his accent, but sort of what he represents. In the second film, it's almost like, kind of the Terminator is something that we've given birth to, or I mean, is Skynet something that's, trying to get free of humans, or like, I mean, which is it? Like Skynet, the hero of its own story. I mean, like, do you know what I'm saying? I feel like, I mean, the film doesn't really touch on that, but like we're saying, like, what is the perspective of Skynet? It really isn't a perspective at all. It's just, and then, it's the hubris of human beings. That's the real kind of villain of the story, right? Because Dyson, even though by the end he's an ally, the idea is that kind of unthinkingly, kind of, he's like Frankenstein, because Frankenstein is the villain of his story, the original Mary Shelley, like his hubris, right? Like it's the modern sort of almost like unchecked acceleration of technology that's going to be our downfall. You could say that's a reactionary streak in Cameron, and to all of sci-fi in a way. The robot that turns on the master, blah blah blah, but it's there, and
what do you mean by reactionary in that context?
The fear of technicism, of technology, of artificial intelligence, what have you, going all the way back to like those first ever robot stories of the workers turning on the master, or automation, sort of like the assembly line, fragmenting society, like people working in those Fritz Lang metropolis factories. That's everyone's fear, and it's like it's based in real things. Like we all live in capitalism, we all have to like work these shitty jobs and all this. Like I mean, that I think this is the undertow of a lot of sci-fi. This sort of, as we're saying, speculative fiction. Kind of Philip K. Dick. There's a huge reactionary streak in Philip K. Dick. He's a born-again Christian. His fear of robots and mind readers isn't for nothing. So like I think there is a conservative streak sort of in the storytelling of Terminator, but that's neither here nor there.
And this idea of like, did we in fact give birth to all this? I mean, it's not even just fear of robots in terms of, let's say, automation, and we have like the Fritz Lang's kind of like factories or whatever. It's also at this point, right, as time goes on, this has different faces, right? This has different layers to it. In the modern day, right, the fears of automation is now we don't have jobs. Now, are we human beings not going to have a utility, right? Recently, there was those controversies about using AI for illustrations. Like, you guys watching this could Google this now. Like, look at that. I forget which magazine it was, but there was some story recently about Alex Jones, right? And the magazine used an AI rendered image of Alex Jones. And I mean, it's exactly what you would get from an illustrator, right? It has a sort of cartoonish quality. It captures like the kind of like logic of him. And, it's like things like that, like little by little.
I think some of these individual cases may be overstated, but I think ultimately, what was I going to say? It still is a fear, a modern fear. It's a fear of kind of something that is specifically modern. I think this, have we given birth to something we can't control? How precisely are we in control? How much can we change the world? How much change can one tolerate? And, the control, a very mediated world we live in now, especially.
And why do we decide that our life is worth more than, say, the machine? I mean, like when John says, you just can't kill people. Why? You just can't. He doesn't have an answer. It's just, you just can't. And it's just, why does anyone value human life? Why do we value human life? Because from our perspective, we decide that human life is important because that's what we are. But, ask some other being, maybe they don't agree. Skynet doesn't agree.
On some level, I think it's a really kind of like brilliant touch, especially in the second film, to not even try to answer some of those questions, and in fact, kind of make fun of them. Like this idea of like, why can't you kill someone? You just can't. That's really, you know, more or less how most people would respond to like, you know, trying to defend like a certain kind of like value, right? Values that are, you know, perhaps like, if not totally divorced from logic, right? There's that kind of like whole, you know, fact value distinction, and whether or not actually there is a distinction is beyond the scope of this video. But basically, like most people would sort of have that knee-jerk reaction when it comes to defending their values as facts, right? They would just say, well, you just can't, right? And in fact, like back to that Dyson scene, this is kind of like made fun of, right? Beyond not offering an answer, there's a point where Sarah is like, you know, she's like, even after she decides not to kill Dyson, she's getting upset at him, right? And she's like, you know, like, you men making these war machines, have you ever actually created anything, actually felt life with it? And immediately, you know, her son, you know, behaving, you know, like a kid, but there's actually depth to it, right? He stops her and says, "Mom, stop."
Like a parent.
She's in the middle, like saying stuff that is like total like writerly cliches.
You,
that it's like,
you men.
It's
Exactly.
like total like writerly
cliches. Be a little more constructive here.
And he not only stops the cliches, but he also prevents further answers, right? That maybe, you know, because maybe they don't really have the kinds of answers that she thinks that, you know, she's working with or whatever. So those are nice touches you could easily miss, right? You could easily think, oh, that's just a kind of like, you know, mother-son joke, but there's a lot of layers, right, in the film that you know, are worth pondering that way.
Well, one of the things I note in my second review is that, again, suspension of disbelief is that if John is so important, why wouldn't they just literally just put him in a cave and cover him with bulletproof jackets and like hide him and then just destroy the Terminator themselves? But then again, you wouldn't have a movie. So, you know, there's all those kinds of things that you just have to just accept. And that's fine. I mean, I'm not one of these kind of like, but it is, whenever you get these time traveler things and these kinds of things, there's always going to be sort of these paradoxes, and you're like, no, I don't know about that, you know. But that goes with the territory. So
I think most of James Cameron's films tend to lag in the last act, if you want to call it that. Just seems a problem with his storytelling generally.
Well, so like we touched on this before, but what do we think about the use of music, right? I found it effective in Terminator 1, just to go back to this idea of you know, like a kind of, you know, this psychological thriller. It's very minimalistic, right? But it works, like in terms of every time that you have the Terminator sort of going, you know, towards his target in some way. Yeah. There's this kind of like, you know, there's this kind of like a synthetic sort of drum thing going on, right? It sounds, you know, foreign. The fact that it's so kind of, you know, insistent.
Almost like has this menacing footsteps.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
But then I was just going to comment briefly about the Guns N' Roses. You said, Ethan, you didn't think that aged well. I'm going to just tell you. So when T2 came out in 91, that's like, was it like 4th of July weekend? I didn't remember the weekend. I looked it up, but it was 91. And that song was everywhere in the commercials, everywhere. So you saw the Hasta La Vista Baby 10 trillion times. It's not funny after the 10 trillionth time, you know? So it was like done to death. And I don't remember, they had sponsors. Was it with Coke or I don't even know, but you'd see it everywhere. It got really tiresome. But there is a reference to Guns N' Roses. If you probably saw that when he has the gun in the box and he pulls it out and the roses. Yeah.
I mean, but that's whatever. I mean, like there actually aren't a lot of those. I mean, I'm aware of how much of a pop culture, well, mass culture sensation it became. Although there aren't a lot of specific references to pop culture things, you know, like bands that really serve to date it in that way, apart from those that we've mentioned. I mean, except for those very specific things like, you know, the make of cars on the road or someone's fashion sense, but if you know, like the plaid shirts and what have you.
Very 90s. Yep.
Yeah, but I think a lot of those differences between the first can be almost summed up in their use of score. The first one, very atmospheric, very cold, has that European tech sort of, you know, synth vibe.
Tech noir. You brought up the title of the bar she's in.
Yeah. I mean, at that point in the film, it could very easily be like we're watching a Lucio Fulci film, like we're watching an Italian, slasher film, about some dancer, nightclub dancer being stalked
Which, by the way, $450 to get into a nightclub in downtown Los Angeles in 1984. $450, and it's all this like very 80s techno-y music. It's so like, you've got me burning.
I actually thought that the use of LA, and obviously, like nobody would really know, but like there's this, just like, RoboCop uses sort of a Detroit in the 80s. In a way that's kind of like very prophetic, right? In terms of like what Detroit eventually became. I mean, you already had like inklings of that, which is why I'm guessing they sort of went in that direction to begin with. But I mean, using LA in 1984, then again, especially in 1991, it had its own kind of like almost like apocalyptic sort of events. On the one hand, right, you had the kind of like, the peaks in crime in the 80s, which is why, like a sort of like a film like this might work specifically in a city like this. But I mean, also, we had
shots of the suburbs. I think that's an important thing, the dingy stuff. We see American suburbia.
He runs over the little truck. And there's a lot of other little things, like remember he pulls the guy away from the payphone and he goes, "Hey man, you got a serious attitude problem."
Yeah.
That was little touches.
Yeah. That wasn't, well, I mean, I guess it is like realistic in the sense that, like this, that guy probably didn't want to actually start a fight with such a large man, right? He thinks of him as a man, most likely. But I mean, like the use of the city, right? Like LA is obviously often a focal point, right? Whether it is Blade Runner, whether it's something else, the fact that it's Hollywood, the fact that it is a kind of cultural epicenter, right? Seeing it, burn up.
Itself well to like, I mean, like it has a history of noir. Right, of like the suburban slasher films we were mentioning, like
or even like Chinatown. Honestly, like that's also that also works. Yeah.
And I mean, also the fact that it is the land of Hollywood. This is like the land of like films and like of like and I think what is it the chase scene in the second film when they're riding down what is it called, the flood bank? I mean, that's been in so many films now. Do you not recall like that?
I think I know. When John's on the bike and then
the infamous motorbike scene in that?
And he pulls him off and he's like, "You're coming over here."
That location has been used in so many different films now. It's a bit like that tunnel in the other Los Angeles tunnel from Blade Runner and all that other stuff.
I mean, that's such a well-crafted, like that scene.
It's
you're just
set piece.
It's just like, and it just shows you. I mean, again, really well done action. It's not just brain dead explosions. This guy is coming for you. I mean, he's in this, and then John's like, "Okay," he's like, "Stop the bike. Okay, you're not here to kill me." I figured that out.
The pacing of it is great.
Yeah.
It feels like a scene or like echoes from old Spielberg as well, especially Duel by Spielberg's first film, which was like a chase film. And it's I mean the motorbikes as well. I mean, there's more of an emphasis on cool in the second film. I think that word's important in sort of this context, like the emphasis on youth rebellion culture. Not just with John being the snarky little teen boy, but leather jackets, sunglasses, like rock music, like gunfights. This is like a Hong Kong action film, where this is real kind of like hero shit. I think it's really interesting as well because I forget. I think Alex was mentioning this too. How we're kind of against the Terminator in the first film. We want Sarah Connor to win, but I think Cameron was really ahead of the curve when it came to like thinking about the story for the second film, because think about other franchises with recurring monsters, right? Especially Friday the 13th with Jason, right?
Oh god.
The first film, Jason's chasing around teenagers and you're like, "Oh, get away from that fucker." But by the third or fourth film, you're with Jason, right? You're like, fucking kill those.
They're fucking in the woods.
Cameron
they should die.
Makes the Terminator the hero, like straight away. And of course, he makes him a proper hero. He doesn't have him be a killer. He's Batman, right? He'll take you right up to the edge of death, but like the ninja code forbids him from ending your life. You know, like that's it. Although, you know, obviously there's the whole story about John teaching him, humanizing him, teaching him not just with the lingo, but with this human ethics, right? Which is somehow unexplainable, but paradoxically, you have to explain it now to this robot. A bit like how you have to explain it to a child. Anyway, our children, a bit like robots, you know, we create them in our image. We have to anthropomorphize them. We have to make them humans. Is that what's going on? How, you know, do children teach us to be more human? More themes. But, you know, the emphasis is on cool and youth culture and spectacle, glamour. You know, these are really, and I think in the hands of more lugubrious directors, this tendency can run amok sometimes. And, you know, it can become a bit, you know, exhausting. And certainly in Cameron's other works, it does, you know, and even by the last act, we become a bit exhausted with the proceedings. And we're kind of like, yeah, just fucking kill the fucker already, and fucking everyone go back to your own time, and let's get this all sorted. But in the middle of it, while you're there, the melodrama works. You believe in the, sort of like the characters, and at the same time, while all this is going on, the cool factor keeps up. You kind of you're still going wow and awesome and great. You know, you cheer when he picks John off his bike. You cheer when he you know, blasts the Terminator through, and he has the big you know, liquid mercury crater in him. You go, yeah, fuck yeah. Like, so that's the main thing. That's not really there in the first film, where it's more like, you know, thriller, kind of, oh fuck, get away from that fucker. Second film, you're cheering, and you're kind of like, and when he goes hasta la vista, you go, fuck yeah, Arnie.
Yeah, and you know, you bring up a good point, like with the like Friday the 13th, you know, by the third, fourth film, you're on Jason's side. You're like, come on, Jason, get him. And it's like, and that's how I felt. I mean, I think I saw the third Terminator film, and I honestly don't consider them even part of the Terminator. I think of Terminator as two films. And I know they made all these shitty films after. And so, yeah, by that point, I'm going to be like rooting for the Terminator to kill him, because I don't care anymore, because it sucks. And I mean, I think I did see the third one. It's not even, it's like a B movie. I mean, it's not even worth mentioning in that sense. It's sort of like with, you know, with the aliens too. I really think of two alien films, and then the rest are irrelevant. It's just junk. I mean, maybe not junk, but you know,
my family are a bunch of kind of like Mormons and ex-Catholics, right? You could put them on a sofa and get them to watch Terminator 2. You know, they might cringe at some of the violence and swear words and stuff, but you could not get them to sit through Terminator 3. Well, how do I know? Because that's how it happened. This is how I saw the Terminator films during like the 2008, you know, when they were bringing out Terminator Salvation. As I was saying, they were replaying all those films on TV. My family sat through the second Terminator film, and they enjoyed it. You know, Cameron works like that. Put on True Lies. Your family can sit through it. You know, different generations can sit through it. Kids can watch it. Adults can watch it. Put on that Terminator 3. No, people are they're gonna have their phones out. They're gonna wander out the room. Someone's gonna go, oh, that's a bit gauche, you know. And then that the difference is marked and salutary in that sense. You know, this is the quality that you get in the second film. Although there are some things.
Has there ever been a film, like a third film in the series or something, that was actually like the best or something? I mean, I can't, maybe off the top of my head. I mean, I don't think any film, any kind of sequel gets better past, you could argue the second one is, like with Terminator. Past that, I don't know of any. If anyone can comment and say, do you know of a series that, like, by the third film was the third, that someone says, oh, the third film is the best?
You could probably view this in terms of, like, you know, first of all, just in terms of how this would be selected, for there to be a number 2 or a number 3, there has to be something of sufficient quality or just importance or like whatever popularity in 1 or 2, right, for you to get to number 3. But oftentimes by that point, right, you sort of gotten everything that you needed to say in the first one or the second one. So anything after that is just going to be, you know, a commercial retread, right? It's just going to be placating someone else's desire.
I will say something popped into my head, and I don't think these are obviously highbrow films. Freddy Krueger movies. The third one is called, it's the Dream Warriors, and it's set in a mental institution. It's the children of the parents who were harassed. That one actually, I mean, again, this is not high art.
No, I agree with you.
That one I thought was much better than even the second, maybe even the first. So maybe that's the one exception.
Yeah.
But again,
I would also add the third Halloween film is much better than the second one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, I think these are genre slashers, so maybe you can get away with that there.
Well, inherently the genre film lends itself to sequels, doesn't it? You know, so I mean, try and come up with a sequel to 8.5. You know?
Yeah. They tried. They called it 9. I don't think it did so well.
Oh yes, I heard of that.
The last thing I'll say is, maybe this is more directed to Jessica, and Ethan mentioned some of this. So like there is like a more an emphasis on youth culture in Terminator 2, right? And it's a little bit reminiscent of maybe some of the kind of stuff that I would see, maybe because it was, so influential, right? I mean, who knows what the directionality of stuff like this is, but I remember seeing some stuff like that in kids shows in the 90s. But Jessica, like, do you view anything about Terminator 2 specifically, or maybe even Terminator 1 as kind of like maybe symbolic of the 90s, inaugurating the 90s? Like what in what ways does that meld into like the decade in general?
Oh, because you want to be focusing, you're going to do your 90s decade, right? Well,
eventually when I do that book, right, you'll probably write some stuff for it as well, because I mean,
I'd love to.
Living through it as an adult, right, gives new kind of content.
I was not an adult. I was still a young person. I'm not that old, but no. Okay. So you made a good point about this. There's Terminator 2 there's a lot of chase. That same year, Thelma and Louise came out. That was a big hit. Again, another kind of road trip film. It's in terms of the 90s, it's kind of like the 90s, 91. There was just a quieter time. Let me try to remember some of the Metallica's Black Album came out. Again, Guns N' Roses was huge. A lot of you would go to the movie theaters to see the films, and what, definitely very different from streaming. Also, the 80s one, the first film, very much just total very 80s. Like I said, the tech noir, the dance. 80s was very like dance, Depeche Mode, and they were big in the 80s, and I mean some in the 90s too, early 90s. But it's like just a totally different kind of like vibe than the 90s. Again, flannel shirts, you see that. You see this is the birth of Nirvana age. Pearl Jam, the grunge bands were huge. There was a grittiness in a way to the 90s. It's like, it was almost like, I think the 90s kind of like is a rebellion from the 80s. I feel like each one is a rebellion of the one before. So like 80s was a lot of big hair, makeup, foofy, big shoulder pads, a lot of makeup and shit. 90s, plain, got rid of the bangs, little to no makeup, but almost like a throwback to the 60s. Hair, colors were very like muted, beiges, in a sense you could say boring. Looking back, you go, it's kind of boring, but 80s were very vibrant and fluorescent colors. And it's just funny how then again, it's a matter of perspective. You go on Etsy now, you can find stuff from those eras that you like at the time. You're like, ew, I don't never wear that. Now you're like, hell yeah, that's vintage. I'll buy that. It's just
simply because no one else is wearing that now, right? Which is why it would work, right?
Yeah, and it's totally like even my mom. She's like, you buy, because I do go on Etsy and I do buy vintage stuff, and I will buy. Again, that's technically used clothes, but it's from an era, and now you can do that, and now what you thought was nerdy then is cool now, and again, because not everyone's doing it. So you want to rock the flannel shirt, you can do it, like it's just all how you wear it. But very, very, I think a rebellion-ish thing from the previous decade, and definitely in terms of fashion. And,
right.
You just saw it in music.
That's an interesting comment about the colors, because I definitely associate the 90s with an extremely colorful palette. Maybe it's because I was, kind of like a kid that was like pre-consciousness in some ways, right? I mean, it was when I think of like kids programming, when I think of video games, when I think of like everything that was kind of like thrown us as kids. I don't know, it might not be that different from decade to decade, because I assume that kids in general respond to colors, right?
Well, things that were colorful, they used to have those horrific exercise suits. They would be like, you'd wear the track pants and then you would put a thing, and it would be an outfit. You'd go out and it would be like, it would be bright pink or blue. That was very early 90s.
That was also 2000s. And I remember like the velour suits, right? That was a rap thing as well.
And then you had people, though, who were late to the fashion. So you always knew when it's like in the 90s and you still have the 80s bangs, you're like, okay, they're from a small town.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's all I got to say about Terminator. Are you guys good on that? Should we transition to the bonus show?
Yeah, well, okay. My review for the one, and then, when I send you for next month, the readers, you guys can see the second one. And the two poems that one I referenced in there, and I go, I found that. Now no one else will unsee it. Anyway.
Okay, so
I wanted to say though, before we sign off, like just to add to kind of this general sort of point about the 90s, like I want to, I think I mentioned before kind of the influence of sort of Japanese and sort of Chinese culture, kind of I think you can see in the film, and I think especially the 90s and 2000s are this point where you see almost this apogee of like cultural exports from Asia and Japan and China in the West and in America. So this increase in films, in books, in TV shows, anime, manga, that sort of thing. I think you can see all of this in the second Terminator film, especially the influence of Akira. There are so many shots, and a huge amount of the special effects are right from Akira. Alex was mentioning sort of the ball, the teleportation ball, like, but then also the mercurial weird special effect. These come straight from the language of Japanese cinema and cartoons. So I think that's a really interesting thing, and something that's almost lapsed now. I think we've seen a kind of a drop off of that kind of halcyon days. I mean, now it's Korea that's the new soft power in the West in terms of just Squid Games, in terms of just at the Oscars, that film Parasite, and their music. My God, the huge. So just that's another thing that sort of places this really sort of strongly in the 90s, kind of the Japanese thing that's going on there. So the mental street there.
Okay.
So in the show notes, you guys will find links to Jessica's article. Also, I'm going to put in a link to Jessica's latest book. Actually, she wrote a book of poetry recently. So maybe in December, we'll get the Bruce Ario show out, a show on your book of poetry. But right now, we're going to transition into the bonus show. We're going to be carrying this conversation over, discussing new topics. I want to ask Ethan Pinch about the monarchy in the UK. Everything, that I could sort of see is just kind of from the outside. I want to hear it from the man himself, who is personally responsible for the Queen's death. But if you want to listen to this, you got to get the patron show on Patreon, right? That's patreon.com/automachination. You're going to get access to not only this show, but all the back bonus content and all the stuff going into the future. Again, once we transition to $500 a month on Patreon, I will be uploading videos of myself, perhaps even live, just straight up working on my creative work, right? A lot of people seem to be interested in this, right? So maybe you could get some utility from that. But thank you guys for watching. Hit like, hit subscribe, and we will see you on the bonus show.